Man, I am sorry. You know what I'm gonna stop doing? What I'm gonna stop doing is I'm going to stop putting timestamps when I'm gonna make a video. So I put on social media that I was gonna do this video, The Color of Satan, at 12:45, and then I got pulled into a bunch of situations, and because I'm a pastor, I gotta deal with things first. So I'm sorry I was supposed to drop this video at 12:45, but I got pulled into so many situations, so I just thought I'm gonna do this video and then I gotta jump back. But I've been wanting to talk about this for a while. So again, my apologies to anyone who was expecting this at 12:45. I've been in a ton of situations, but I thought let me just go ahead and get this video out and then I gotta jump back. All right, the title of this video is called The Color of Satan. Now, I'm asking you to stay with me. This is going to be a little bit different than some of the videos that I'm known to do. Stay with me if you can stay to the end. You know, sometimes on the long end, I go around 30 minutes, maybe shorter than that because I got to jump back to some stuff. But I want to talk about this issue. All right, this is an important issue about this. And I've heard people talk about some of these things and all of it, right? So I don't know where people are at with this, but let's jump into this. I'm gonna jump right into this. Appreciate those of you that are watching. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. I realize now you guys say that at the beginning for the algorithm. You got to trick that algorithm joint, right? So hit that like and subscribe button. All right, let's talk about this issue, the color of Satan. Before I explain what this is, we gotta walk through a couple of things. So let me walk you through a few things, and then you'll see what I mean. In order for us to understand remotely what I mean by the color of Satan, we have to go back in time for a second. So we gotta do a brief history lesson and work our way up. All right. And this is not going to be what you think, but you're going to get it if you stay to the end and watch it. All right. This is going to make sense once we get to the end. But it's not going to be what you think. So stay with me so you can see where I'm going with this. All right. In order for us to understand the color of Satan, now many of you are probably thinking, especially when you look at the thumbnail, or we've seen pictures of Satan and he's always red with black horns and a black tail and all that stuff, right? That's whack to me. This is what we're going to talk about, the real color of Satan, and you'll see what I mean. To do that, we have to start elsewhere. We have to start back in 1676. All right. Many of you may be familiar with this, but 1676 in Jamestown, Virginia, was a monumental year in the colonial days of America. So this is pre the established United States of America. This is 100 years before what we would call the American Revolution, which Americans, we celebrate on July 4th, 1776, Independence Day. 1676 is an important year to understand the color of Satan. Let me explain what was happening in 1676, all right? Now, the settlers came to Jamestown, Virginia, was the first place they landed in 1607. And then you had about maybe 12 years later, you've heard all this, 12 years later, slaves come in 1619. And from 1619 to 1676, there was a culture in the colonial days of America that most people don't understand, all right? This is where a lot of people had problems with the 1619 project from the people who wrote that. Here was part of the problem. During that time period, there was something called the head right system, all right? The head right system was an ideology that was speaking to the people coming from England. And here's what it basically was. If you were coming from England to America, depending on how many tickets you could purchase, how many people you were bringing with you, you were given 50 acres of land. All right, 50 acres. That's a lot of land. So if you had money and you were coming to America, you were given a bunch of land. All right, 50 acres per ticket. So if you bought 5 tickets for 5 family members, you had 250 acres of land. All right. Now, obviously, the people that were coming to America were not all rich and couldn't afford that. So they got moved to the western side of Jamestown, Virginia. and all the people that could afford it lived on the eastern side near the water. All right. The people that couldn't afford it were the indentured servitude folks. Now, this group of people were not just African slaves. There were free black people who lived there, slaves, African slaves lived there, and then indentured servitude. And essentially, what the headright system was indentured servitude. If you cannot afford to really come to America, then you would agree to work between 3 to 7 years for someone, and then you would get to buy a piece of property. Here's the problem, though. The labor was so intensive that most of the people that came from Europe didn't live long enough to work 7 years. They might work 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, and they would die, right? So these people couldn't even last the length of the contract they made in this headright system. So it was good for the people who were on the closest to the water on the east of Jamestown, Virginia, but all the people on the west were essentially the poor people. So you create this class distinction. All the rich people over here, and the poor people live on the western side of Jamestown, Virginia, where there are a lot of Native, well, American Indians. I'm going to call them Indians right now, just so you know what I'm talking about, because you start indigenous people, and then it becomes who you're talking about. So for the purpose of this, I'm not trying to offend anyone. I'm going to call them Native Americans for right now, okay? American Indians, Native Americans, those are indigenous peoples. They live over there on the outside of this area in western Jamestown, all right? So what happened was there was a guy named William Berkeley who was sort of the governor of Virginia, and he created the House of Burgesses, which was essentially their capital, where they would vote on things, and all the people who had money made decisions for all the people that don't. Well, there was a guy named Nathaniel Bacon, and I'm not going to give you all the background to this, but he rose up against William Berkeley. He wanted to attack the Indians, the Native Americans, because they felt like they were in danger. All the poor people who didn't have money, the indentured servants, were all offended at the rich people because they had to live over there in these meager conditions, and they got upset. So Nathan Bacon rose up, and he was going around killing Native Americans, and William Barclay, it looks like Berkeley, but it's pronounced Barclay. William Barclay rose up against them, and there was all this battle between them, and there was a big fight. That was a big deal, but that's not what I want to talk about in terms of this idea. What this rebellion did, they call it Bacon's Rebellion. You can look this up anywhere. Here's what happened as a result of this rebellion. After Nathan Bacon died, there became a new law that changed America. Because you see, up until that point, there were indentured servants, right, which were white people, men and women. There were African slaves, and then free black people all living together who were part of Nathan's rebellion that rose up against and fought the Native Americans, but then also fought the elites in Jamestown, Virginia. So there was the rich versus the poor, and the poor were winning. Even though Nathaniel Bacon wasn't poor, but he was the leader. They rose up and caused some damage. And then after that happened, everything changed. They passed a law, and in this law, they decided to get rid of the class system. All right? So the class system of rich and poor was taken out of the way. They gave a lot of the white people, if they would turn in their arms and stuff, they gave them acres of land, some oil, and all of those people decided, okay, we now have some income. We now have some land, which is why they came to America. And the slave trade went from indentured servitude, which included white people, to exclusively the African slave trade. All right, promise you, stay with me, because this is going to be important to see what I mean about the color of Satan. So once you have after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, you have this war happens, and then after Nathan Bacon dies, William Barclay becomes back in charge, and he passes this law that exclusively separates free white people and free black people from African slaves, and the slave trade becomes predominantly African, right? So only black people now are the ones who become, this is 1676, right? Now, a lot of people think this led to the American Revolution 100 years later, but that's not really important. That was a significant moment in American history, and you'll see why by the time we get to the end of this, all right? Shortly after that, a man philosopher in England by the name of John Locke, he was the foundation of American economic ideology, okay? when we talk about what America is and government and all this stuff, all of this came from a man by the name of John Locke. All right. And he came up with something, all his philosophy, it was all about establishing America and putting limitations on those in authority, limited government. Everything that we did really came from this guy named John Locke. All right. Now, John Locke, in his original the way he laid out his philosophy, it was called life, liberty, and property. All right. So John Locke basically said it was the government's job to provide everyone, right? Everyone was entitled to life, liberty, and property. But you and I know this phrase as life, liberty, and happiness, right? So the way that the original documents were written was based on life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, of owning property. That's why people came to America. Even when they became indentured servitudes, they came to work and own land and own property to start something for themselves, right? If they couldn't, were incapable, then they got pushed farther to the west in Appalachia. Just after Jamestown, Virginia, you get into the Appalachian Mountains. This is going to become important in about 5 or 10 minutes. All right. They move over to the Appalachian Mountains. So this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property was what was intended, but then it changed. It changed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson actually made the change. Now, no one knows why Thomas Jefferson made the change when America won their independence from Great Britain and from England, and it went from life, liberty, and the pursuit of property to happiness. No one knows, but many people speculate that not everyone was going to attain property, and the elites did not want poor white people coming there and being able to attain property unless they had a certain ethic. In fact, uh, um, Richard, I'm forgetting his last name, he told the Queen of England that the poor whites need to be able to come to America and prove that they're civilized enough to be able to have property. So the term poor white trash actually came from other white people who were calling non-elite, financially secure white people, calling them poor white trash and moving them further and further west over to the Appalachian area where the mountains were. All right. So now you have within the colonies this huge economic issue. You have rich elites versus the poor, and this becomes the foundation of laws of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, which got changed by Thomas Jefferson before signing the Declaration to the pursuit of happiness. Okay. Why is this important? This is important. And how does this pertain to the color of Satan? Stay with me. Stay with me. We're going to get there. All right. So you have in the foundation of America this idea of rich and poor, and the rich people were the ones who owned slaves and were making money off of slaves, and the poor people, they were the ones trying to find jobs that slaves couldn't have, and they kept having to move further and further west, being attacked by Native Americans because they didn't have the financial means to provide and protect for themselves. And then the poor kept moving to the west, and the east kept growing and growing and growing because it was close to where the boats could land and the ports could bring in slaves to establish the elites making money off of African slave trade labor. So this becomes the foundation of America. This idea of enterprise, not indentured servitude, but slavery and all these things, right? This becomes a functional reality. And this is where the color of Satan starts to really show up, all right? When we look back throughout the history, one of the things that we recognize and that we understand it, but we minimize it, is the great conflict. In fact, in the Bible, there are the greatest common distinctions in the Bible of people are twofold. One is ethnicity, Jews and Gentiles, and the greatest distinction in the Bible is not just ethnicity, but it's also rich versus poor. All right, if you go in your Bible and you type in rich, you'll see what, 170 something verses. I think there are 168 times in the ESV translation, rich is mentioned, and there's 173 times in the Bible that poor is mentioned. So this is a functioning reality, and this is American society. It is rich versus poor. Okay? In the Bible, that is a significant distinction and one of the greatest ones. Because in the New Testament, what God was saying was, through Paul primarily, that the Gentiles, the ethnic distinction of the Gentiles, are now also included with the Jews as part of the kingdom of God. So many of the churches, the letters to Philippi and Galatia and Romans, and there was a mix of previously ethnic Jews and now Gentiles going together in the same church, right? You also had one more ethnic distinction, Jews versus Samaritans. Those were the two within the larger microcosm of Jew and Gentile that really hated each other. But the ethnic distinctions in the Bible are important, but it's really to say the Gentiles have inherited salvation. The other great distinction in the Bible has nothing to do with ethnicity or skin color or anything. It has to do with economics. It has to do with being the rich or the poor. As I noted, the poor is mentioned 173 times in the Bible. In almost every single one of those verses, God is saying that he cares about the poor. He wants to provide for the poor. He warns the rich about treating the poor a certain way. He even describes Jesus as though he were rich, he became poor, right? So God, starting in as early as Deuteronomy, is communicating he has a heart for the fatherless, for the poor, and he promises to be with them. You get Jesus in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Even though it wasn't economically poor, the idea of poor has always been, biblically speaking, an important reality for God, and the rich have always been, biblically speaking, the people that God warns the most. You will be hard pressed in any credible translation to find God warning the poor. You have a couple verses about the lazy do not eat, the lazy, all this stuff, right? And then you have in 1 Timothy 5, if a man doesn't work, he doesn't eat, right? But the vast majority of the warnings are against the rich, okay? What does this have to do with the color of Satan, and where am I going with all this history, all right? We're going to start to make the case now. It's going to start to get serious now. So in American society, you have a significant division of rich versus poor. And it goes back to Bacon Rebellion. It wasn't about color, racism. It wasn't about that. There were indentured servants who were white. There were African slaves and then free black men who banded together. Some of them were cohabitating. You talk about have interracial marriages were happening then, and they got divided because it was causing problems for the elite. And Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 proved that if you bring these people together, they have something in common. What? They're poor. And those poor banded together and overthrew the rich. All right? So then time goes on. America has the American Revolution, and it establishes itself as its own nation, and it switches from life, liberty, and the pursuit of property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, some say, which I agree with this, based on how we see things played out, that there were people who did not want even poor white. The white rich elites did not want people who did not fit in their social class, right? They did not want them to be able to earn money and have property. They wanted them pushed further west in the Appalachia. They were poor, white, trash. All right. So what does all this mean? Okay. Here's what all this means. First, we have to talk about the real slavery and the real Jim Crow. All right? I'm going to bring up the speed. Here we go. The real slavery and the real Jim Crow. So when slavery started in America, there were indentured servitude. That's what it started with. Then you had Native Americans who were working, and they were killed because they couldn't handle the immune system of being around different people, Europeans. And then you had Africans coming. Up to 1676, there were free black people, African slaves, and indentured servitudes. After Bacon's Rebellion, all the white people got separated. They were given property, rum, oil, and a gun, if I'm not mistaken. And they were able to say, okay, we're going to separate the class. So the people who are not elite that are white will be middle class, and you guys live over here away from the African slaves. The slave trade would be primarily African. So the real Jim Crow and the real slavery have a color in mind that's not what we're typically taught. Here's what most of us are tempted to or have been taught is that slavery and Jim Crow were about racism, white versus black. That's not really true. And this is where we start getting to the color of Satan. That's not really true. Slavery, chattel slavery, from 1619 to 1676 and beyond, was not about white versus black. It was about the color green. It was about making money. It was an economic issue. It wasn't largely targeting African American or African slaves. They were trying to make money off the poor, anyone who would be considered poor. And if you were African, you definitely were put in the poor class. You were definitely put there, right? So when Jim Crow comes after the Civil War, when you look at what Jim Crow actually was, Jim Crow were essentially economic sanctions against black people for being freed and no longer forced to make money for rich white elites, for the most part. Sure, people say, yeah, black people own slaves too, but that wasn't the primary issue. That wasn't the primary problem. Jim Crow was an economic sanctions from the government towards a particular ethnic group, stopping them from being able to make money. So what does this all have to do with the color of Satan? All right. Now, many of you probably clicked on this video thinking that I was going to make a case about Satan's actual color, but the color of Satan is not about what color he was. The color of Satan is a strategy. The color of Satan is a strategy that he put in place throughout American history that we're still affected by right now. Now let me explain, having given you, I'm rushing through this history because I got all the stuff I got to do after this. It was a strategy, the color of Satan. You see, here's what happened. The real issue, you've heard this said before, that America's greatest original sin is the sin of racism. Almost all of us heard this, whether we agree with it or not. This isn't about whether you agree with it or not. This is the narrative that's been cast. This is why the 1619 sort of ideology was written, and then you have the 1776 ideology to push back against it. This idea from Ibram Kendi to all the way down to whoever, that America's original sin is racism, is ethnic color. Some people call favoritism, right? But that's not true. America's original sin is greed. It was about mammon greater than the Messiah. Let me explain. Indentured servitude was already a functional part of the colonies when they came to America. They could have easily, when they brought Africans over, applied the same principle. If you can work for 3 to 7 years, we'll give you land and you're free to go and do what you want to do. But that's not what happened. Once they realized, okay, poor whites and Africans together were too strong for the colonies, at least in Virginia. So you separate them by giving the whites some land and some alcohol and some gunpowder, and then all of a sudden it becomes the black. And it seemed like, oh, this is a white versus black issue, but that was an economic decision. See, the problem was with slavery was it wasn't that we hate black people initially. It was the black people are the ones that make us the most money because they don't die off. They live longer than the Native Americans and the white people. That's the real issue. And so America, the greed of American and of the elites when America started was about money, right? But what the devil did, he made it about color. See, he made it about skin color instead of class distinctions. And let me explain why I think this happened. Because in the Bible, the greatest distinction in the New Testament is really about rich versus poor. But throughout the whole Bible, you get this idea, this theme about this idea right here: greed over grace. Listen to what Ezekiel 16. Now, this is an argument that many people in the alphabet community make, saying that that Sodom and Gomorrah was not about same-sex sexuality, but was about something else. Here's where, when you hear that argument, many of them get their argument from this verse. I'm going to use this verse to make a different point. Okay, here's what he says in Ezekiel 16:49. Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. Okay, stay with me. Let's watch this again. Behold, the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. So here is Ezekiel the prophet saying, and some people take it to be that was the real issue, not sexuality. That's not really true completely, but there is a case to be made that part of the problem with Sodom was that they had excess of food. They were proud, had excess of food, prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. Now think about that based upon what you know of American history or what I've just laid out. The whole point of slavery and then Jim Crow was that some people were proud, had excess of food, prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. That was the problem. You look at that blueprint and you put it over what happened in America and how the people who were professed Christians justify having slavery as a fundamental reality. And I'm not just talking about owning someone else. They had indentured servitude, didn't he? I'm talking about all that came with that, right? How do you, as a Christian, justify that? Well, here's how. The color of Satan. See, you think they think it's about skin color, and the Bible doesn't really talk about skin color. It doesn't talk about ethnicity as much as we give it credit. It talks about in Galatians 3 that no Jew, no Gentile, no slave, no barbarian, all this stuff, right? Slave, free, Scythian, barbarian. You get Revelation 7, every nation, tribe, tongue, but you don't hear a lot of talk about ethnicity, particularly black and white. You don't hear that in the Bible. You hear Jew, Gentile, Jesus tore down the wall of hostility. So a lot of people thought, oh, okay, well, this is an ethnic issue, but the real issue was the color green. It wasn't the color black, it was the color green, and these people minimized because the Bible says a lot about greed. If you look at any category of sins, you will not see racism in there, even though we know that that's a sin. You don't see that in there. People say racism's not even in the Bible, that's favoritism. Okay, all that being the case, but you know what is in the Bible? Warnings against the rich. Warning the rich to treat the poor a particular kind of way. James saying that true religion is this, to care for orphans and widows, right? There are tons of warnings about, you got the story of the rich young ruler who would not give up his riches. You got multiple warnings in the book of James about to the rich. All throughout the New Testament, you have this idea of rich. But what happened throughout American history was no one thought that they were doing anything. It wasn't about being rich. These were ethnic distinctions, and these people ethnically are built for this based on all these different ideas. But the reality was, if people were willing to treat other human beings made in the image of God based on their skin color, but they were deceived because the motive for doing that was money. Jesus said, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. See, America's greatest sin is not racism. It's mammon is greater than the Messiah. It was greed over grace. So how does this continue to play out? Well, lately, for many of us who have been alive in the last 10 to 15 years, we've heard this kind of dichotomy. One side is calling out white privilege, and the other side's calling out black victimology, right? So if you're black and you're claiming that you don't have economic, then you call it, or you're just playing a victim. But on the other side, it's like, well, you have white privilege. Here's the problem. Here's the problem with one. Let me start with white privilege. Here's the problem. Remember when I said that the white people were moving west? Poor white people were moving west of Virginia into Appalachia, all right? If you go on YouTube and look up Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance, you will see a documentary. It was a book I read that was life changing for me. And I think I was like, man, you got to take this into account. And that's when it really, really hit me. Wow, what a good hustle Satan has been doing. When you say white privilege, there are tons of white people in America who are poorer than black people, who have no way of escape. They live in the Appalachia Trail. They all moved over there based on having come in through Jamestown and working their way west, right? Working their way. They live in Appalachia to this day for generations, what many people would call poor white trash. These people do not have privilege. They worked in coal mines. They're getting jobs at Walmart in many ways was career aspirations for these folks. These people have been poor their whole lives, but they were woefully forgotten until Donald Trump won the presidency. And when they interviewed J.D. Greer about his book Hillbilly Elegy, they asked him, how did these people vote? And he said, listen, these people, at the beginning of his book, you know what he said? He said, I've seen many welfare queens in my day, and none of them were black. None of them were black. So America propagated this idea that it's black people who are on welfare, who are poor and all this stuff. But the reality is there are more white people on welfare and that are poor than any other ethnicity in the country. And they were woefully forgotten until Trump came into their city saying, make America great again. These people were gone from public thought, like they don't exist. Poor primarily meant black people. And here's what Satan did. He led us to focus primarily on skin color instead of ethnic distinctions of rich and poor. God cares significantly about rich and poor. So when people started saying, oh, you guys got white privilege, then all of a sudden people start pointing to, wait a minute, what about all these people over here? They don't have white privilege. LeBron James makes more than them. And then it becomes, well, you're just playing the victim. But the reality is that the Satan was playing all sides because the real distinction, the real problem in America was not just white versus black. It was ethnic class. It was people being forced to be poor and the rich not doing anything about it, not caring anything about it, calling either people poor, white, trash. So if you think about what Jim Crow was, look at Jim Crow. All of those laws were economic laws. Now you may have said, yeah, because you're black, we'll give you that. But the laws were about the color green. Everything from no funding in schools, from redlining, owning property. Redlining was huge because owning property is how you acquire wealth in America. So when you create these laws where you can only live in certain neighborhoods that don't, so this is what's happening. It was economic. And Satan is making everyone focus on skin color. But the reality was, and what the Bible is concerned about, don't get me wrong, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that there's no racism and those things aren't real. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the color of Satan is a strategy to make everyone focus on color and miss the deeper issue of greed. See, America's original sin is consumerism. It's not racism. There was so much, everyone wants this and they're buying this and they're buying that. And you see this happen. I could give you so many layers of this. The Great Depression started because of 7 rich bankers who invested in stocks, made all these people invest in those stocks. Then when the money got up, they pulled the money out. And because the stocks weren't real, they crashed. And 1/5 of America's GDP in 1929 plummeted in one day. In one day, it was all economic. It was greed. And a lot of the people that were poor, when you look back at that footage, you see a lot of white people that are poor. And these people have existed. And they have been forgotten. So when they hear white privilege, they get offended because it's not really true. White people don't always have privilege. Now, granted, if you can make out of those situations and make yourself look presentable, then yeah, there is a degree in which white skin was seen as non-threatening, where black skin was the opposite. That's a different conversation. What I'm talking about is the strategy of Satan has been to make all of us focus on color. and then blame people. So think about our economic system, right? When you say black victimology, 100% there are black people playing the victim, 100%. But at the same time, though, you're basically complaining to people who are saying we do not have the economic freedom. We are poor. I'm going to do a part two to this video that's not called the same thing, but to make the deeper point. So I'm not going to say more what I feel like saying right now. I'm going to restrain myself and not. But I am going to say this. Definitely black people have been playing the victim, 100%. There's some to add, no question. But there are a lot of people who are just saying, hey, listen, we don't have the economic gains that we thought we would have by now. And some of that is because of the ramifications, the sort of the ripple effect of all of that economic racism. See, we talk about Jim Crow from the standpoint of it being black versus white. But Jim Crow was about the color green. It's an economic sanctions against an ethnic group of people for no longer making them money in the way that they used to. This has gone woefully missed in American history. We haven't even gotten to the fear of communism and the Great Red Scare and how much of, if you were called a communist at one point in the country, you would lose everything, just like you can lose it today when you were called a cultural Marxist or called a white supremacist, whatever it was. The names always change, but the ideology is the same. Even the idea of socialism, there's a fear of an economic change. And I'm not saying socialism is better at all. What I'm saying is America's original sin is not racism, it's consumerism. And what Satan has done, he's done a fantastic job of making us focus on color and miss the fact that there's poor people of every ethnicity. And it's become white versus black. And people are so tired of it at this point that you can't even say nothing about it or you're woke. Or if you disagree with it, then you're white, you have white privilege. And the whole point, God is saying, I care about the poor. Do you? Oh, conservatives, no, they care about the poor. They give to the poor more than the left. No, do your research. Conservatives give to nonprofit organizations like churches. Churches don't always get to help the poor. They don't always help the poor. The left will talk a lot about caring for the poor, like Black Lives Matter, all that about Black Lives Matter, and then you rob people. You hoodwink. Malcolm X was talking about Black Lives Matter just as much as he was talking about conservatives. You've been hoodwinked. You've been bamboozled. You've been run amok. You robbed all these people under the guise of caring about the poor, and all you did was use that money for your own selfish gain. And many believers are so blinded by the enemy focusing on color that you miss the fact that what God cares about is the poor, because there's poor of every color. What a good strategy by Satan. We're over here talking about racism and ignoring classism. Now, don't get me wrong. Let me end with this. Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. Okay? He said that. So there will always be poor people. This is why it's dangerous to mock the poor and just call that victimology. You're just playing a victim. I watched an interview. You guys got to either listen to or read J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. Life-changing for me. It's the first time I read stats and dialogue and heard the struggle of white people that I know black people have had. It's not a, so all this talk about, oh, it's the inherent traits of black people, it's poor. If you go to any country in the world, say you go to the most beautiful country in Italy, right? And you go there and you just love it. It's amazing. The architect's beautiful. But there's going to be somewhere in that town, they're going to tell you, hey, listen, that part of town is dangerous. Don't go there after dark. Why is it dangerous, sir? Because people may try to rob you and kill you. Why? Because they're poor. Not because they're black or because they're whatever. They're poor. Whenever they're poor, they're going to take from people that do have. It's the nature of the beast, right? Now, there's a lot more I want to say, but this video is already long, and I need to part two this, because the part two is the other side of the coin. The part two is going to bring it home, but I wanted you to see that the color of Satan is a strategy. And he's tricked all of us into making us think that the great sin of America is racism, and what we're really battling today is equality and racism. No, no, no. There's some truth that there has been ethnic hatred, 100%. Second command, second, violations, fear of, image of God violations, no question. But what Satan has made many of us think for a long time, it's about race, about color. It's about no, the color of Satan is green. It's green. And he's blinded us and made us think it's about black versus white. The color of Satan, the strategy is green. It's about money. It's about money and making us care about money. Now, some people are going to hear this and think I'm saying we shouldn't make, I'm not, the Bible doesn't say don't be rich, but it warns the rich. It warns the rich to not put your hope in rich and to treat people who are poor with respect, dignity, and to help them. And let's just be clear. In part 2 of this, I'm going to let you see some stats, some real-time data to show you that the real problem in America is not black and white. There are elites financially, and there are non-elites, poor people. And that gap is huge. And while there may be some ethnic pushback or ripple effect, true, but a lot of that is people's hearts have grown cold. That's why you'll watch people talk about the poor like it's a moral issue. Do you know anyone who was like, you know what? I could work hard today, but I'd rather be poor. Now, there may be some that think that way. This is a crazy world, right? You got people thinking they're dogs and donkeys, right? That could be true. But the reality is most people, like people didn't come to, America wasn't a country where everyone showed up and was like, all right, everyone, we're all here. Everyone choose how they want to live. And it wasn't like black people and some white people like, you know what? Hey, bro, we're going to live in these poor neighborhoods and live over here and have to fight for scraps. We were. That's not how it works. That's not. There are systems in place that and perpetual things that have happened. And what God is going after, all these recessions, all this stuff, the Great Recession of 2000, all this stuff that's happening, God is exposing. He's exposing. God is flipping over America's tables. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that in the next video. I've been talking way too long, and I appreciate every single one of you that has been watching. The comment section is off the hook. I'm sure there's people that hate me that are calling me woke. Guess what? So what? I don't care if you feel that way. I'm giving you American history, and I'm showing you how Satan has used racism to blind us all, because in the Bible, the second greatest, besides Jew and Gentile, the second greatest distinction is rich and poor. And almost no one's talking about that. Some people are, but that is not what we think when we think American history. We think white people owned slaves and black people were slaves. And then we think black people are just playing the victim because we did this. We focus on Martin Luther King's credibility as a moral person. He did it. Man, Martin Luther King, I'm going to end with this. If Martin Luther King really was an adulterer and was all these things and wasn't really a Christian, was wrong on the gospel. If that's true, you know what's sad is that God had to use a non-Christian, an adulterer who was wrong on the gospel to shame America for their treatment of people. Why didn't God use all these great, solid theologians like whoever from back in the day? God didn't use, and he used, if they're right about Martin Luther King, then God used a non-Christian, wrong on the gospel, adulterer, sinning in sexuality to shame America for its economic treatment of a particular ethnic group. So if you're a Christian boasting, well, he didn't even know the gospel, well, shame on you, fam. You should be sobered that God had to use a non-Christian to show Christians how to be more Christian. What do I know? I'm a dude that's woke, right? Maybe you can't handle the truth. All right, I've been talking too long. I got a ton of stuff going on. It's crazy right now. My world is crazy. I'm over here like Atlas trying to hold the world up. And I just got to, and I'm not really. I know the Lord has it, but I still got to do stuff. Love you guys. Like and subscribe to the channel. The next video, be on the lookout tomorrow. It's called God is Flipping Over America's Tables. Wait until you hear the actual stats in this joint. I guarantee that many of you, if you don't now, will agree with me. America's original sin is not racism. It's not color. That's Satan's strategy. It's consumerism. It's mammon versus the Messiah. That's the real problem. Chattel slavery in America was an economic decision. Jim Crow was an economic decision. Did it disproportionately affect an ethnic group? 100%. But that's not the real issue. That's not the real issue. And when people stand before God, they're going to find out. That's not the real issue. What do I know? Like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Appreciate y'all. I'm out of here. The chat is popping right now. It's a lot of comments, but I got to go. I got drama happening over here and over here. Love you guys. Grace and peace. See you.